You know that walk back to your car after an interview? That specific kind of silence where you're just sitting there in the driver's seat, not quite ready to start the engine, mentally replaying everything that happened in the last hour, trying to figure out if that moment when the interviewer laughed was a good sign or just them being polite. Wondering if the question they asked about your 5-year plan meant they were genuinely picturing you there, or if it was just a standard question they ask everyone. You pull out your phone, you text someone, "I think it went okay," with a question mark because you genuinely don't know. And then you drive home and spend the next 3 days in this low grade, anxious fog, checking your email every 40 minutes, trying to read meaning into how long it's taking them to respond. That feeling, that uncertainty, that desperate attempt to decode something that felt like a foreign language is one of the most universally uncomfortable experiences in adult professional life. And the frustrating part is that the information you're looking for, it was right there in the room with you. You just didn't know how to read it. My name's Roger, and I spent 14 years as a hiring manager at 2 Fortune 500 companies, sitting in on more interviews than I could ever accurately count, making decisions that shape people's careers and livelihoods, and honestly, sometimes their entire life trajectory. And somewhere around year 4 or 5, I started noticing something that genuinely fascinated me, that the outcome of most interviews was actually visible in the room long before anyone said a word about next steps. There were signals, consistent and readable signals, that I was sending as an interviewer without fully realizing it, that told a perceptive candidate exactly where they stood. Not sometimes, almost always. The thing is, most candidates are so focused on performing, on delivering the right answers, projecting the right confidence, remembering their prepared examples, that they're not paying attention to the other person in the room at all. And that other person, the interviewer, is leaking information constantly about their interest level, about how they're processing you, about whether they're already mentally placing you in the role or quietly counting down to the end of the conversation. What I want to share with you today are 10 of those signals. The real ones, the ones I watch play out across hundreds of hiring decisions, the ones that if you know how to spot them will tell you almost exactly where you stand before you've even left the building. Not so you can relax and coast, but so you can lean in at exactly the right moments. And so you can walk to your car afterward with something a lot more useful than a question mark. Let's get into it. Sign 1. The interview runs longer than scheduled, and they're the one extending it. This one seems obvious on the surface, but there's a nuance to it that most people miss. Almost every interview I ever conducted had a scheduled end time. And when a candidate was not the right fit, I was aware of that end time in a very specific way. I was tracking toward it. Not rudely, not obviously, but internally I was managing the clock because there was a finite amount of useful information left to gather, and I wanted to use the remaining time well. When a candidate was genuinely compelling, something different happened. The clock stopped being something I was tracking and started being something that was getting in my way. The conversation would start pulling in directions I hadn't planned for, and instead of steering back toward my question list, I'd just follow it. And then I'd look up and realize we were 12 minutes past the scheduled time, and I hadn't noticed. The key distinction here is who is extending the conversation and why. If the interviewer is looking at the clock and wrapping things up on time, that's neutral information. If they're the one asking follow-up questions past the scheduled end, introducing new topics, saying things like, "Actually, one more thing I wanted to ask you about that is not accidental," that is someone who doesn't want the conversation to end yet because they're still gathering information they find valuable. You can't gather information you find valuable from someone you've already mentally ruled out. If your interview runs long, and you didn't cause it to run long, pay attention. That's a real signal. Sign 2. They start selling you on the company and the role. There's a very specific shift that happens in interviews when a hiring manager moves from evaluating a candidate to wanting a candidate. And it's remarkably consistent once you know to look for it. They stop asking questions designed to test you, and they start telling you things designed to impress you. They'll start talking about the company culture in warm, personal terms, not the rehearsed mission statement version, but the honestly, one of the things I love about working here is version. They'll mention benefits, growth opportunities, team dynamics, exciting upcoming projects. They'll talk about what makes this role interesting in a way that goes beyond what's in the job description. They're basically trying to close you before you've even left the building. I used to catch myself doing exactly this. I'd be mid-interview and suddenly I'd be talking enthusiastically about an initiative the team was about to launch, painting a picture of what the next year would look like, because in my head I'd already decided I wanted this person and I was worried they might be interviewing somewhere else too, which from a negotiation standpoint is very useful information for the candidate to have. When an interviewer transitions from asking you questions to answering questions you haven't asked yet, they've tipped their hand. They're no longer extracting information to make a decision. They're laying groundwork to make an offer appealing. If you notice this shift happening, it means the evaluative part of the conversation is essentially over in your favor. Sign 3, they ask about your availability and timeline. This one is so direct, and yet so many people don't register it for what it is. When an interviewer asks when you could start, or whether you're interviewing elsewhere, or how your timeline looks for making a decision, they are not making small talk. Those questions don't get asked about candidates who are in the probably not pile. Think about it from the hiring manager's perspective. If I've spent an hour with someone and I'm not feeling it, the last thing I'm going to do is start asking when they could join us. That question implies a future. It implies that I'm already mentally moving toward an offer and starting to think logistically about what comes next. Questions about your notice period, your start date availability, whether you have other offers coming. All of these are forward planning questions that only make sense if the person asking them is seriously considering putting something on paper. I remember one particular candidate early in my career as a hiring manager, someone interviewing for a senior analyst role. About 40 minutes in, I asked her how much notice she'd need to give at her current company. She answered, "We moved on." And she later told me she had no idea that question was significant. She thought it was procedural. It wasn't. I was already doing the mental math of when we could realistically get her on the team. The decision was basically made at that point. When they start asking about logistics, they're thinking about you as an employee, not as an interviewee. That's a very different thing. Sign 4. The interviewer's body language opens up and stays open. I talked in a previous video about how candidates are broadcasting information through their body language constantly. What most people don't realize is that the interviewer is doing exactly the same thing, and their body language is considerably harder to fake because they're not the ones under social pressure to perform. Early in an interview, most hiring managers have a kind of professional guardedness, controlled posture, measured expressions, a slight evaluative distance. It's not unfriendly, it's just the baseline of someone who is in assessment mode. What happens when that assessment starts resolving in your favor is that the body language literally opens. The arms uncross, the posture relaxes, they lean forward rather than sitting back. They start making more expressive facial reactions to what you're saying, nodding more genuinely, reacting with visible interest rather than polite neutrality, maybe even laughing in a way that's unguarded and real rather than professionally courteous. The lean is the one I'd watch most closely. A hiring manager who is leaning forward in their chair is a hiring manager who is engaged, who is being pulled towards you by the conversation rather than maintaining professional distance from it. It's a physical manifestation of interest that the body does almost automatically, and that is very hard to sustain artificially for an entire hour. If you notice the interviewer's energy becoming warmer, more relaxed, more genuinely expressive as the conversation progresses, that trajectory matters. People don't relax around candidates they're planning to reject. They relax around people they're starting to trust. Sign 5. They introduce you to other people you weren't scheduled to meet. This one is honestly one of the clearest signals there is, and when it happens in an interview, people often treat it like a casual, coincidental thing. It is neither casual nor coincidental. When an interviewer walks you over to meet a team member who happened to be passing by, or pops their head into a colleague's office to introduce you, or says, "Let me grab someone I'd love for you to talk to for a few minutes," they are doing something very deliberate. They are socially investing in you. They are connecting you to their world before there's any formal reason to do so. And people do not do that with candidates they're about to reject, because introducing someone to your team and then telling them no creates an awkward social situation that hiring managers actively want to avoid. I did this once with a candidate who I knew about 30 minutes into the conversation was going to be exactly right for the role. The team lead, whose work would intersect most with this hire, happened to be in the office that day, and I very casually suggested we grab 5 minutes with her, which, from the outside, might have looked spontaneous. It wasn't at all. I wanted them to meet because I was already thinking about team dynamics. I was already past the hiring decision in my head and into the onboarding logistics. When the interviewer starts voluntarily expanding your social footprint within the company before an offer is even made, pay very close attention. That's someone who has already, at least informally, made a decision. Sign 6. They share candid, insider information about the company. There's a version of information that every interviewer shares with every candidate, the polished, public-facing version. The official culture description, the company values, the strategic vision that sounds like it came directly from the website. And then there's another tier of information that only gets shared when an interviewer trusts you. The real stuff. The "I'll be honest with you" stuff. Things like, the team has been through a tough transition this year and we're looking for someone who can help stabilize things. Or, the previous person in this role struggled with X, so that's something we'd want you to be thoughtful about. Or, even more subtly, between you and me, this is a role that has a lot of visibility right now, which is actually a really good opportunity for the right person. This kind of candor is not accidental, and it's not standard procedure. It happens when an interviewer has stopped evaluating you as a stranger and started treating you as a prospective colleague, someone they're beginning to trust with real context, rather than just selling the opportunity to. Sharing insider information is an act of inclusion. It's the professional equivalent of letting someone backstage. When an interviewer says something that sounds like it goes slightly beyond the official script, something that has the texture of a genuine admission, rather than a prepared answer that's a trust signal. And trust signals, at this stage, flow in the direction of people they're planning to bring in. Sign 7. They use "we" and "the team" when describing your potential future there. Language is incredibly revealing, and this particular signal is one that slips past most people completely because it's so small. But after 14 years of sitting in hiring conversations, I can tell you that the pronouns an interviewer uses when talking about the future are one of the most consistent tells I observed. There's a very noticeable difference between an interviewer who says the person in this role would be responsible for, versus one who says you would be working closely with Marcus on the reporting side, or you'd be sitting in on our Thursday all hands, or we'd get you up to speed on the client base in the first few weeks. One of those framings is describing a hypothetical. The other is narrating your future in a space they've already mentally placed you. I caught myself doing this constantly. The moment I was genuinely excited about a candidate, my language would shift from third-person hypothetical to second-person future tense. Without meaning to, I was already narrating their onboarding, already picturing the team with this specific person in it, and the language just followed the mental image. Listen for "you" instead of the candidate. Listen for "we" and the team in a way that implicitly includes you. Listen for specific, concrete details about what your life would look like there, the kind of detail that only gets described when someone is visualizing it as a real future rather than a generic one. It's a small thing. It's also a very honest thing because it's happening below the level of conscious communication. They're not trying to signal interest. The interest is just showing up in the grammar. Sign 8. They ask genuinely curious follow-up questions, not just scripted ones. Every interview has a question list. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's loose, but there's always a rough structure, a set of things the interviewer intends to cover in roughly the order they intend to cover them. And for candidates who aren't creating real engagement, interviewers work through that list fairly methodically. Question, answer, note, next question. It's functional. It's professional. And it has a specific rhythm that an experienced candidate can feel. When a candidate genuinely captures an interviewer's interest, that rhythm breaks. Instead of moving to the next scripted question, the interviewer starts asking things that weren't on any list. Things prompted purely by something you just said that they found interesting or unexpected or worth exploring. Wait, can you tell me more about that? How did that situation end up resolving? That's an interesting way to think about it. Where did that perspective come from? These organic, curiosity-driven follow-up questions are significant for a very specific reason. You cannot be curious about someone you're not interested in. Genuine curiosity is involuntary. It's what happens when something someone says creates a genuine desire to know more. And that desire doesn't arise in conversations that are going nowhere. I remember sitting across from a candidate once who mentioned, almost in passing, an unconventional approach she'd taken to a particularly difficult project. And I completely abandoned the next 3 questions on my list because I just needed to understand how she'd arrived at that approach and what happened. We spent 20 minutes on a topic I hadn't planned to touch at all. She got an offer 2 days later. When the interviewer is going off script because they're genuinely compelled by what you're saying, that's not a distraction. That's the sign you've been waiting for. Sign 9. They give you a specific, detailed timeline for next steps. The way an interviewer closes out a conversation tells you an enormous amount about where you stand. And there's a very telling difference between the 2 main versions of the closing. The first version is vague. We'll be in touch. We're still in the middle of the process. We should have an update in the next couple of weeks. These closings are professionally courteous, non-committal, and designed to leave all options open. They're what you say when you're not sure, when you want to keep the door neither open nor fully closed. The second version is specific. We're looking to make a decision by Thursday of next week, and you can expect to hear from me by Friday at the latest. Or, the next step is a conversation with our VP, and I'm going to try to get that scheduled for early next week. I'll email you tomorrow with a few options, or even just, I want to make sure we move quickly on this, so I'll follow up with you by end of day Wednesday. Specificity requires investment. When an interviewer gives you exact names, exact timelines, exact next steps with committed follow-up dates, they are not being thorough about a process they're unsure about. They are managing a process toward an outcome they've already decided on. Vagueness protects everyone. Specificity signals commitment. And here's the small one that I think is genuinely underrated. If the interviewer says, "I'll reach out to you," rather than "HR will be in touch," that's them personally investing in the follow-up. That matters. A hiring manager who personally commits to contacting you is a hiring manager who has already made this slightly personal. Sign 10. Something in the room just feels different, and you're not imagining it. I want to end on this one because I think it's both the least concrete and, honestly, the most consistently accurate signal of all. And I debated whether to include it because it's hard to describe precisely, but that's kind of the point. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive social creatures. We've spent hundreds of thousands of years reading rooms, reading people, reading the temperature of conversations for survival reasons that go way back before job interviews existed. And we're good at it in ways that our conscious mind often can't fully explain or articulate. When an interview is going genuinely well, when the interviewer is engaged, when the conversation has found a real rhythm, when you've stopped feeling like a candidate being evaluated and started feeling like a person having an interesting conversation with another person, you feel it. There's a quality to the air in the room that's different from when things are flat or forced or politely going through the motions. The pauses feel comfortable rather than tense. The laughter, when it happens, feels real. The eye contact has a warmth to it that isn't just professional courtesy. I've had candidates tell me afterward that they knew somewhere around the 30-minute mark that the conversation had shifted into something different. That they stopped feeling like they were performing and started feeling like they were just talking. And in almost every case, when I heard that that was the candidate we hired, not always, but almost always, don't dismiss this feeling as wishful thinking. Don't inflate it. Either wishful thinking exists, and it can look a lot like genuine intuition if you're not careful. But if something in the room genuinely feels different, feels warmer and more mutual, and more like a real connection than a professional evaluation, trust that signal. It's coming from a part of your brain that's been reading rooms for a very long time. It's usually right. Here's what I want to say before I let you go, because I think there's a version of this kind of content that creates a particular kind of anxiety where instead of relaxing into the interview and actually connecting with another human being, you're now running a parallel analysis track, mentally checking boxes, trying to figure out if the interviewer leaned forward enough or used you enough times. And if that's where you land, I've done you a disservice. So let me try to correct it. The 10 signs I've walked you through today are not a checklist to monitor in real time. They're context. They're background understanding that should change how you feel walking into and out of an interview, not what you're thinking about during one. Because here's what I genuinely believe after 14 years of watching people get hired and not get hired. The candidates who receive the clearest, most consistent versions of the signals I've described are almost never the candidates who are trying to generate them. They're the candidates who were too busy being genuinely present in the conversation to be performing, too busy actually listening to what the interviewer was saying, too busy being authentically curious about the role and the company and the person sitting across from them to be running a separate internal performance review on themselves. The signs I've described, the extended time, the selling, the pronouns, the candor, the body language, the specific timelines, they all share something in common. They're involuntary responses to genuine connection. And genuine connection can't be engineered. It can only be created by actually showing up, actually listening, actually caring about the outcome for reasons beyond just getting a job. The best interview you'll ever have will be the one where you forget, for stretches of it, that it's an interview at all, where it just becomes a real conversation between two people trying to figure out if they can work well together. In those conversations, the interviewer doesn't need to be decoded afterward. They've made their interest visible in a dozen small ways throughout, and you'll feel it in your bones by the time you get to the parking lot. That's what you're building toward. Not the ability to read signs, though now you can, but the presence of mind to create conversations where the signs have something real to reflect. You already have more to offer in that room than you think. Go let them see it.